Today we will discuss about inline functions and macro functions, right? I hope all of you have heard about macro functions. You may have worked out with it in C programming, right? Which are going to be declared before writing any program. That is at the header file declaration you will have with hash defined kind. Okay. So basically, the macro functions. The concept of macro function is it substitutes the code wherever it is being called, instead of the taking the control from calling function to call, and after the processing is done, the returning control from call to call and all kind of thing, right? Basically, when you are working with the function, normal functions, what happens is the control will be passed, okay, from the calling function to the called function. Before the control is passed, the arguments, if you have any, fine, those arguments are going to be passed. Yes or no? And then once the execution is done at the call function, if there are any values to be returned from the function, the values will be returned, and then the control will be returned from the function. This is how exactly happen in the normal function. Okay. So, but in macro function, the calling, the control, passing the control from the calling function to call function and returning the control from call to calling and all kind of thing will not happen. Okay, it just substitutes the code wherever it is called. Fine. Macro function are generally single line functions. For example, hash define, let us say, square of a number, right? I can use capital letters, the function name. And here, the argument that I am passing, you need not to pass the type of the variable, right? Unlike your normal function. In our functions, you pass the type and then space argument, right? Here, you need not to pass. It is a typeless, okay? It's a typeless kind. Giving a space and then you define the code for the same. For example, square of a number is nothing but x into x, right? So, hash defines square of x space x into x. It means this particular function name is square and having one argument x, and what it is doing, it is returning the square of the argument that you have passed, right? Here the argument is x, right? The parameter is x. So the square of that parameter, that is x into x, is going to be returned when you call this particular function. So the mechanism, if you look at it, fine. Mechanism if you look at it, substitutes the code wherever it is being called. It substitutes the code wherever it is called. Okay, so it means wherever you call, this is the code, right? That is going to be simply substituted there. But in general, normal function, what happens? The control will be passed, right? Control will be passed from normal calling function to the call function. After the processing is done at the call function, the control will be returned from the call function to calling function, right? So in that, what happens is extra overhead, right? For sending the control and returning the control, which is being removed here in this case, right? But you cannot have more lines of code. As I said, it is a single line code, right? If you have, like, for example, square of a number, which you can rather perform it easily like this, right? But if you have more lines of code, then this is not suitable. Got it? So, but then there is some side effect here in this macro function. The side effect is what exactly it does is when you call this function, if you pass some expression, let us say, you can pass some expressions also to the arguments. Yes or no for functions? Well, you're calling the functions for the formal parameters of the function, you can pass some expressions also, right? But in general, in normal function, what happens if you pass some expressions, that expressions will be evaluated before the function is called. It means first the expression is going to be evaluated, and whatever the value out of it you get, that is going to be passed to the formal parameters of the function. But in this case, what happens is, if you have some expression, that expressions will be simply substituted, because what is happening here when you call the macro function, it is substituting the code wherever you are calling it. So if you pass some parameter, that parameter, if it could have been some expression also, that expression will be substituted in place of that parameter along with the code where the code was being substituted, rather, right? So because of this expressions which have been substituted, there is a possibility of some discrepancy to be leaded, rather, right? So that is a side effect with this particular macro functions, right? That is a side effect you have with the macro function. To avoid this side effect, right? I hope the side effect is clear to all of you. When you have certain expressions being passed, what is happening? That expression, without having been evaluated, it is directly substituted in the code along with the code substitution wherever it is called. So the expression is going to be evaluated in the code itself. It is not before the code being evaluated. Like how for normal functions, if there is some expression being sent, for example, I++ you are sending, fine. I++ will be evaluated first, right? In normal functions. Whatever the value out of it you get, that value will be passed to the function. So that value will be substituted in the code. But whereas here in this case, what happens, that I++ will be simply substituted here, I++ into I++. Then what happens, there is a possibility that in post increment, what happens, value will be used first, then the incrementation done. So for example, you have some I equal to 2 and you have passed some I++ here, right? While calling this function, okay, you have called this function, let us say, with I++, where I is, let us say, 2. Then what happens, that I++ is simply substituted here. It means when it is substituted, I value will be used first, then incremented, right? So I gets 3. Then here, in case of next x, when you have to get a value for next x, that next x value, I++ means I becomes 3 here, 3++. It means 3 will be used and then it will be 4, right? So what happens now, the result that you get out of it is nothing but 2 into 3, which is nothing but 6. 6 is not a square of a number. Actually, you wanted to find the square of a number, right? But when you are passing I++ and where I value is 2, what do you get? You will get 6. You will not get the square of a number. Yes or no? So this is a side effect that you have when you have one line of code. Okay. So to avoid this, side effect, in C++, inline functions are introduced. Okay. Inline functions are introduced. So what is inline function is, it is like a normal function, okay, but here it is coming up with the advantage of macro function. In macro function, what is the advantage? That you have the extra control overhead for sending the control and returning the control is removed, right? which you find it in our functions. So that advantage you get with inline function. It means whenever you call inline function, it is similar that, it's going to substitute the code. But then there is a side effect in macro, right? That is being overcome here in inline. What is the side effect? When you are passing certain expression of this kind, that expressions are simply substituted, right? Without having been evaluated before. But in inline function, what happens? The expressions will be evaluated before being substituted, right? So that is the advantage. Fine. So overcoming with side effect resulted in macro retains the advantage of macro. Okay, so that is how you can say it is more helpful. So how do you basically work out with inline function? There is an inline keyword we have, right? So inline functions are defined with inline keyword. Inline keyword, okay. Followed by function return type, followed by return type, function name, arguments in number, order, and type. Okay. So, for example, for the same square of a number, here if I have to write with the help of inline function, how do I define using inline? I-N-L-I-N-E, inline. These are all lowercase letters. Is a keyword. All keywords are in lowercase, okay? Inline. Then return type int. Function name I am giving as square. I am taking an argument int small x. And now here I am finding the square of this parameter value and returning the same, right? So when you write with inline keyword, what happens? The compiler will identify that this function is an inline kind, right? It's a single line. So whenever it is called similar to that of macro, the code will be substituted, right? Code will be substituted instead of having sent the control from calling to call and then the return of control from call to call and all. So the extra overhead basically requires for this sending and returning the control and all will be removed as such, right? From being compared with the normal functions, right? That kind of advantage you are having, like what it was there with the macro function. But the side effects that you have found in macro, which is when basically you're passing an expression, where you are resulting with some kind of discrepancy, also been removed here, right? So what happens is, if you are calling the square function by passing, let us say I++ in your program, so where I value, let us say, is 2. In that case, what happens? The expression will be evaluated first before it is being substituted in the code, right? So it is when evaluated, see in post increment what happens, value will be used first and then increment will be done. So it means it sends what? 2. 2 to the code. So it means 2 into 2 is going to give you what? 4. It gives you square of a number. Right? So in inline you can find the square of a number. But whereas in macro function you may have seen that because of the expression being directly substituted in the code, what is happening? You're not getting the square of a number, right? Here when you say I plus plus, I value will be 2, and here when you have again I plus plus, right? So by then you come here, I value becomes 3. So 3 plus plus means 3 will be substituted and I value will be incremented. It means you get 2 into 3, which is nothing but 6, which is not a square of a number, right? So this was the side effect that we found with macro, which has been overcome with the inline functions available with C++, right? Basically, why do you go for inline function is when you have a single line code, right? When you have single line code, it is better to go with inline because the extra overhead that you basically need for setting the control and returning the control is reducing the efficiency of your program than compared to the advantage that you get out of the functions, basically, right? The function advantage, as we said, the one important advantage is reusability, fine. And additional the compound advantages that you get out of it is like the memory saving. Whenever the function is being called, the same memory which is being allocated to the particular function being utilized every time. That was an advantage, right? But that advantage you may be losing here because the code is substituted here whenever you are calling. It means a separate memory is required for the substitution. Fine. But then the amount saving, the amount of memory that you save is not much when compared to the time that you probably have to spend in sending the control and all kind of thing. Fine. When you have a single line of code, fine. So it is better to go with inline function when you have one line or two line of code, basically single line I can say rather, right? But if you have more lines of code, it means if you have 10 lines of code or 100 lines of code, then obviously normal functions are quite better. Why? Because the memory saving will happen in the normal functions. Yes or no? Why? In normal function, what happens? The same memory being utilized, which is being allocated for the particular function every time when it is being called. If you have 100 lines of code and if say inline could have helped you in substituting the code, it is something like every time that 100 memory, 100 lines code memory is required every time whenever it is called. It means from memory point of view, you are losing a lot of thing. So that way, if you see, normal functions are better. So if it is a single line code, then inline functions are better from efficiency point of view because the control sending and returning overhead, which is being rather removed, fine. Though the memory extra, of course, required every time whenever it is called because the code is going to be substituted whenever it is called, right? But memory saving is not a big issue here because it is a single line, right? So it is better to gain the advantage that you probably get it through the macro function, right? Of removing the extra overhead which is rather required in sending and returning the control. So that way, if you see, inline are quite better for a single line code, but for more lines of code, it is normal functions. Okay. Inline function is quite handy and coming up with all the difficulties overcoming from the macro. That's the reason why inline are quite better than compared to your macro function, right? I will demonstrate here with an example taking the same code for both inline and macro and showing the discrepancies that may result at both the places. Okay, so let me demonstrate the same here with the help of an example, the same example that I have discussed here. Yes, my screen is visible.
Yes, sir.
Okay, let me write the code. We'll create a new project otherwise. Creating a new project. Taking the same example here. First, define the macro here. Hash define where I'm giving here in capital for macro. And capital letters I'm using for macro. Giving it space, you can define the code for the macro function. X into X. Okay, next coming to inline, I'm defining an inline function here. INP line, and it is returning integer value. Here I'm using lowercase letter for this to distinguish it from the macro. Taking an argument here, I'm using small x. Then inside this, I'm having code to just evaluate the square of a number and return the same. Okay, x into x, return x into x. Okay. So you can see here I have written one macro function. This is the macro function has defined square of x followed by x into x. It is just returning you the square of the number that you have passed as an argument to it, right? And this inline function, this is also very similar to that. This is defined with lowercase. It's also finding the square of the number which you have passed as an argument, right? Let us now demonstrate it with an expression and then see which will give us the proper result, right? From the mechanism point of view, both are same, right? Whenever you call the macro function, it simply substitutes the code, fine. And inline function also simply substitutes the code. And then there itself, it will allow you to execute, right? Without having the control to be sent from the calling to call and the return of control from call to calling. The extra overhead which is probably needed for all this activity is removed from both of this macro and inline, right? That is an advantage which you probably find with this function. So the time saving is that from both the ends. But then, as we said, there is one side effect in macro, as I said, right? In macro, I have a side effect. That is, if you pass some expressions, it will simply substitute the expression without having the expression been evaluated. So, whereas in inline function, that expression, if there, then it will evaluate and then substitute the value that you get out of it, rather, right? In the substituted code, wherever it is called, right? So that is the reason why for this particular example, I'll take a suitable example here to demonstrate the same. I'm taking two variables, I and j, let us take I value is 2 and j value also to be 2, right? To be 2, no issue. And now I want to print first the macro function result. Macro function result, I say, right? Here I am calling macro function square of I plus plus, I am saying, right? I plus plus. Okay, where I value is 2. And now I am having another line of code with the help of which I want to print inline function result, right? Okay. See out macro function result equal to square of I plus plus okay, and in the next statement I am printing the result from where? Inline, okay, inline function result. And here I am passing j plus plus, okay, j plus plus. See, I and j both are equipped with 2 initially. I am passing I plus plus for macro, and here I am passing this is small square. I should be small square. Okay, capital square is the macro function. Yes or no? Macro function. And small square is representing what? Inline function, right? So now let us demonstrate this and see the result, right? Which one will give us the square of a number? Is it okay to all of you? Select the language here as C++ and then run the program. You can see the result. There are certain warnings. You can just ignore the warnings anyway. You can see the result. You have got, macro function result you got as 6, whereas inline function result you got as 4. Yes or no? Because of this n actually. Instead of n, it was printed as again execute it. You can see the output here. Can you see the output here? Macro function result you got as 6. 6 is not a square of a number. Inline function result is 4. 4 is a square of a number. See, here I passed I plus plus where I was 2, and here I passed j plus plus. J is also 2. I should have got the same result at both the places. But in macro function, I did not get. Why? Why I did not get? Because it is substituting the expression as it is. Yes or no? It is substituting the expression as it is, because of which what is happening? It is going to give you the result as 6, which I have evaluated here. You can see, right? When you pass I plus plus where I value is 2, I plus plus is substituted in its code, right? It means I++ into I++. In place of this I++, you get 2. By the time you come here, I becomes 3. So 3++, it is going to be 3 here, right? So that's the reason we got 6 here. But whereas in inline function, what is happening? The expression is going to be validated. If you have sent I value with 2, the expression I++, then the expression which is going to be validated first. In post increment, the value will be used first and then increment. So I value which is going to be used in the code is going to be 2. 2 into 2 is going to be 4. Yes or no? So because of which you can see the result here. You know, in macro function you got 6 and you got 4 in inline function. So advantage of macro function retaining with inline and coming out with the difficulty resulted in macro is what the exact inline function advantage is, right? If you have a single line code, probably inline functions are quite better. But if you have more lines of code, then it becomes inefficient instead of efficient. Okay. I hope this is clear to all of you.